So hello and welcome to everybody. I'm Rachel Hewitt and I'm the director of the Newcastle Centre for the Literary Arts, and it's really lovely that you could all join us tonight. Before introducing tonight's event, I'd just like to describe what else we've got coming up over the next few months. Next week, on Thursday the 18th of February, Cal Flynn will be in conversation about her book, Islands of Abandonment, Life in the Post-Human Landscape. Cal's book is a book about abandoned places, about ghost towns and exclusion zones, no man's lands and fortress islands. And it's about what happens when nature is allowed to reclaim its place. The following week, on Thursday, the 25th of February, this kind of underlying theme of ghosts and ghostly places will be reignited when Roger Clark will be speaking about his best-selling Natural History of Ghosts, 500 Years of Searching for Proof. In March, we're really proud to be hosting the Poetry Book Society's Spring Choice of Poets, featuring Jen Hadfield, who will be reading from her collection, The Stone Age, which explores neurodiversity, and Rowan Ricardo Phillips, who will be reading from Living Weapon, a collection described by Granta as a piercing, flaring collection from a virtuoso poetic voice. Later in March, that theme of ghosts resurfaces when novelist Natasha Pulley will be talking about her latest book, The Lost Future of Pepper Harrow, a historical novel featuring a Japan that never was, a future lost, ghosts that are not dead, random numbers and clairvoyant samurai. After Easter, we've got 3 more brilliant events for you. Continuing our series of sort of tag team events, passing the baton events, Charlie Gilmore, who spoke last semester about his wonderful book Featherhood, will be in conversation with US biographer Blake Bailey about his forthcoming biography of Philip Roth. Then in May, novelist Niven Govindan will be talking about his forthcoming novel, Diary of a Film, a novel about cinema, flaneurs and queer love, and about stories and the ongoing question of who has the right to tell stories. And finally, to end our season, we have the multi-award-winning novelist John McGregor, who will be talking about his forthcoming novel, Lean, Fall, Stand, an engrossing exploration of an Antarctic researcher brought low by tragedy and desperate to communicate with the outside world. All of these events are going to be online. They're all free to attend, but you do need to register. So to do so, please go to our website, which is www.newcastle.ac.uk/NCLA. Now, this brings me to tonight's event, and it's a huge pleasure to be hosting Kerri Andrews and Joanna Taylor. Kerri and Jo are actually co-directors with me of a research network called Women in the Hills. And our network is exploring the many factors that shape, enhance, but also constrain women's involvement in walking, running, and climbing in the hills. And our network is exploring those contexts historically and in the present day. Now, this issue of access to the outdoors is something that's become even more urgent during lockdown. Recent studies have shown that, as the World Athletics president Seb Coe recently reported, the world is seeing an 80% increase in exercise during the coronavirus crisis. But it's really important to note that this increased access to the outdoors is not being equally shared between men and women. A study conducted by Sport England has shown that actually 42% of women have reported a drop in activity levels during lockdown, a drop that's linked to increased caring responsibilities, the closure of gyms, and inability to exercise with other people. Now, Kerri's wonderful book, Wanderers, A History of Women Walking, shows that many of the factors that women walkers today contend with, and also many of the pleasures that women today find in walking, actually have a long history, a history that's much longer than we might immediately imagine. And in pinpointing these stories of early women walkers, Kerri makes it very clear that outdoor sport and leisure is not a historically male preserve, but that women have always found a home in the hills. Now, Kerri is Senior Lecturer in English Literature at Edge Hill University, and she's published widely on women's writing, especially in the Romantic era. And she's also a keen walker and mountaineer herself. Tonight, she's going to be in conversation with Joanna Taylor, who is herself an expert in the history of women's walking and mountaineering. Jo is Presidential Fellow in Digital Humanities at the University of Manchester, and among her numerous publications and projects, she immersed herself in the early history of women's walking by climbing Scafell Pike in the Lake District in the same clothing that Dorothy Wordsworth wore during a climb of that same mountain in October 1818. So Jo and Kerri are ideal interlocutors about the subject of women's walking history, and they're going to be in conversation tonight for just under an hour. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask during their conversation, please put them into the YouTube chat, which should be, I think, on the right-hand side of your page. And you don't need to wait until the end. You don't need to wait until you're being prompted to put them into the chat. Please feel free to write them down while the conversation is happening and these ideas are occurring to you. So now it's over to you, Jo and Kerri, and I'm hugely looking forward to tonight's event.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks everybody for coming along. It's an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with Kerri about her lovely book. I think it would be quite difficult to overstate the impact on the histories of walking that this book has in foregrounding not only the role of individual women as prominent walkers, but also in highlighting the many different opportunities that seeing walking and pedestrianism through women's eyes can give us as we negotiate, and as Rachel gestured towards, renegotiate our understandings and experiences and relationships with walking today. So Kerri, hello. I wanted to start with a couple of what I think might be quite personal questions. I wanted to know what it was that that led you to writing this book, and I think also related to that, what made you want to write it, and what kind of hole in our understanding do you think it's filled? I think its success really speaks to the fact that the book has been urgently needed for a while.
Thanks. Yeah, it's the book had a strange genesis. I thought I was writing a book about how our access to the uplands has changed. I thought I was going to be writing about drove roads and old routes through the landscape, and how differently we experience those to roads and made paths and signposted paths. That's what I thought I was doing. And I have a little note in the very first notebook I had to myself to go, look for women's accounts if they exist.
Oh, the irony.
So that was the level of ignorance I was operating under. And it wasn't really until I started working on what I thought I was writing about and had some conversations with people about what was coming out of it, that someone suggested I was perhaps writing a different book, and that would be more useful. So at that point, I started to more seriously look out for women's stories. And that was also accompanied by an experience of reading books about walking by men. And I'm not going to name them because they made me really, really cross, which was so glib about how it was totally impossible that women ever could have done it. They would never have enjoyed it, and gave so little space to women's accounts. So there was a book that was nearly 300 pages that I'd read, and they had literally 4 on women walkers, and had just dismissed the possibility that there was anything else that they needed to look at.
My absolute favourite of that genre is the one that says that women's walking is great because you can really tell how sexy and confident a woman is by the way that she walks. For men, in fairness, what fairness needs to be given to this one, it says that you can also tell a man's confidence, and that's important. But it says something about the history that you've been kind of negotiating in writing this.
And I suppose, in a sense, at least that person acknowledged that women did indeed walk, which is a step further than some of the books that I'd read went. It was quite extraordinary, and it just made me suspicious. well, is this true? So that was the very basic idea that I was testing out to start with, was, is this true? So I started reading all sorts of things, looking for hints, tips, pointers, having conversations with people. I remember talking with you a few years ago and you putting me onto Harriet Martineau, other people I found through chance conversations in Los Angeles, or just through brief references in books, and then following that up and then finding in most cases, oh my God, there's actually a huge amount of material here that they've written. What's going on here? How has this not been documented? So there was also a period of disbelief that I was the first person to come across this. And I don't think I was the first person to come across it, because there's a lot of literature about women's walking, but no synthesis, nothing that had brought it together. No one had spotted a pattern, that there was a history there that really did need to be told. So that's it, as I say, the book had a very awkward, bumpy start, but once I got the sense that, okay, yes, there is enough material here, no one has done this before, this needs to be done. From that point on, it was quite a clear trajectory. So I started working on one woman at a time, and I was quite selective about who I covered, because for me, one of the things that these books by men were doing was valorizing walking, because it was so culturally significant, because writers did it and writers found walking important to their creativity. So it seemed to me necessary to demonstrate, well, hang on, women writers also found walking important. So that was quite a narrowing methodology. So I was focusing on women writers, but specifically writers who had reflected in detail about the walking that they'd undertaken. So with a slightly different methodology, this book could have featured hundreds of other women. It's not just 10 stories, there are hundreds out there. They just didn't necessarily make for an interesting story. I wish I could put Jane Austen in there, because she was walking all around Hampshire and loved going for walks. Elizabeth Bennet, my favourite literary walker, all muddy hems and determination. But all Austen writes in her letters is, I went for a walk. And there was nothing I could do with that, I didn't think. But women's walking is there in all sorts of records. It's in their published writing, it's in their letters, it's in their journals. And it just feels like an unforgivable omission that mostly men, but people who've written about walking have just not challenged those received ideas and gone and checked the archives, because there's so much there. So yeah, the book came out of me getting really cross, and
as many of the best things do, channel that anger. I think one of the things that your book does really nicely is to foreground those accounts by women, and we'll come to a few of them over the course of the next half hour or so. Some of them are just absolutely stunning. But I think one of the things that the book is lovely with is situating those accounts of historical experiences and these beautifully recollected reflections on what walking means for each individual as variously a woman writer and as somebody who just wanted to get outside. And you situate those stories really nicely alongside your own development as a walker. Can you say a little bit more about how, because I think it wasn't necessarily an easy, straightforward path for you, I don't think.
No, it wasn't. And the idea to do that with the book also wasn't mine. That was talking to a friend of ours, Matt Sangster, who said, well, you're a walking woman too, don't you? And I went, oh. And that was really the first time I'd ever thought of myself as a part of a tradition.
That's really funny, because I think if I had to name women who walk, you'd probably be at the top of my list, having been bested by Kerri on several fells and hills. It's I just find you so impressive on the fells that I find it difficult to believe that it was so difficult.
Well, thank you. But I've always found our walks very companionable, and that's been a very important part for me. So I remember as a child wanting to go for walks, but my family aren't outdoorsy, they aren't into exercise. This wasn't really a part of my everyday life. And it wasn't until I was at university in Leeds doing my PhD that I started to take it more seriously, and went up to Top Withens to commune with the Brontes on a very hot summer's day without any water, without any equipment whatsoever.
Rite of passage for an English lit student, I think. Do you even count as one unless you've been to Top Withens and tried to have a romantic experience?
Well, this is actually headed towards Gothic by the time we'd finished, because we didn't take a map. I had no clue what I was doing. It was really sunny. And I remember that we got lost. We ended up dropping down into some random valley. And luckily there was a pub. And I just remember walking in, ordering 2 pints of soda water with blackcurrant and basically just tipping them down my throat and then staggering back to Haworth, just grateful to be alive. So that was slightly traumatic. But from there, started to get more into it. And I was very lucky. I was trying to get a bit fitter at this point, and I joined a squash club at the university and made some friends. And they invited me to go with them to Snowdon. And I'd not been to Snowdonia at all, had no idea what I was letting myself in for. There was a recurring theme in my walking development of total pig ignorance. So this was both protective and slightly intimidating. So we went to Snowdon and we stayed overnight, and we made this, we went for the summit. But we were walking with a group of men as well, and they were much fitter than me. I mean, far fitter. And they were so fast, and I just couldn't keep up. And eventually they decided I was too slow, and they headed off to the top on their own. And I was really lucky that the 2 friends that I'd made at Squash Club, the 2 women, stayed with me and were really encouraging and supported me up the mountain, so that eventually I got to the summit as well. And it was an experience that's lived with me, because it was quite traumatic, and it's meant that it took me a long time to learn to trust people when I was walking with them. It still matters to me that somebody doesn't leave me when I'm on the peaks. So that relationship with your walking companion, which is why when we're talking about the walks that we've done, it's always companionable. It always feels comfortable and safe, whereas that walk was terrifying. But it also demonstrated how good walking was, how exhilarating it was, the delight at getting to the summit, the sense of achievement. All of that was my first experience, and it was intoxicating. So walking around Yorkshire, and then moving to the Lake District, discovering the Lake District and bigger mountains. And then 10 years ago I moved to Scotland and found bigger mountains again, and that's been one of the joys of the last 10 years, is realizing how much fitter I needed to be to tackle those mountains, and getting fit enough, and then going off and exploring all sorts of wonderful locations in the mountains, places, and trying to climb the Munros has given me a real structure to explore the country, and it's taken me to some wonderful vantage points, really truly memorable experiences, some of them slightly frightening, some of them exhilarating, but it's been absolutely fantastic. So it's been a trajectory that's involved a lot of help from a lot of people, and that companionship of walking has really mattered.
Yeah, I think that's so true, that there's nothing quite like fell walking for highlighting when your rhythm is out of kilter with somebody else's, and also nothing quite like fell walking for bringing you into the same rhythm as the people that you're with. You can start off a walk strangers, and by the end of it feel like you've known each other for years. There's something about your feet falling in the same places, and your heart rate doing something similar, and your breathing getting ragged at the same point. That's just so intimate. It just creates a sense of companionship so quickly. I'm guessing that your walking has been a bit impeded recently with all the snow and ice and other horrors that I hear have been visited on Scotland. I'm on the coast in Lancashire. We've had no snow, but I hear dark things about up where you are, a foot of snow and things. Happily, this has not impeded all women walkers throughout history, and today is the birthday, I think, of one of the most accomplished Scottish women walkers who loved a bit of snow. A happy birthday, Nan Shepherd. And she's one of the people that you focus on really beautifully in your book. In fact, she's your future, isn't she, for the next several years? So I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about Nan Shepherd's legacy and maybe read a little bit from that passage.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I do have a foot of snow outside. It was -15 when I woke up this morning. It's not got above -5 all day, so it felt a good choice to talk about Nan Shepherd, given it's her birthday, but also Nan Shepherd talking about the snow and ice in one of the most extreme locations in Britain. So I'm going to do a short reading from the chapter on Nan Shepherd, where she's on the summits of the Cairngorms. Nor was Shepherd any less awed by what happened to the mountain's waters when they grew still in the winter freeze. With so much ground over 4,000 feet in height, the Cairngorms experience a climate more typically seen in the high northern latitudes, one of rasping winds and scouring avalanches. Its passes were once giant roads for ice, and the slopes of its high mountains and many eastern-facing corries can hold snow the year round. As a walker, Shepherd found the elementals of water and ice and their effects on the landscape intriguing but unsettling. As a result, her writing never romanticizes their power, even as she expresses a profound love for the ways in which they have sculpted the mountainside. And Shepherd knew directly what snow and ice could do to frail human bodies. In the time of her youthful acquaintance with the mountain, 4 people were lost in a blizzard, while another slipped to his death on a patch of snow in May. Looking back 30 years later, in preparation for the publication of The Living Mountain in 1977, Shepherd had an even sorrier litany to recount. During that time, which, she said, in the life of a mountain is nothing, but was to some of the human existences, she recalled, everything. Many tragic things had occurred in the snows of the mountains. And Shepherd writes, a man and a girl are found, months too late, far out of their path, the girl on her braided hands and knees as she clawed her way through the drift. She was one of my students. I see her living face still. A sane, eager, happy face. She should have lived to be old. 70 men with dogs and a helicopter go out after a lone skier who has failed to return and who is found dead. And a group of school children, belated, failed to find the hut where they should have spent the night. Shelter against a wall of snow, but in the morning, in spite of the heroic efforts of their instructress, only she and one boy are alive. The present tense brings life to these tragedies spread over half a human lifetime and brings them hauntingly back into the present. But such emotion was balanced for Shepherd elsewhere with a cold rationality about the risks of mountain walking. Declining to pass judgment on the decisions that brought so many people to such bleak ends, Shepherd instead saw such choices as part and parcel of an important quest to know the mountains. Such danger, she said, is the risk we must all take when we accept individual responsibility for ourselves on the mountain. And until we have done that, we do not begin to know it. Shepherd, for her own part, accepted that individual responsibility. Eschewing any grander aim, she spent one whole midwinter day wandering from burn to burn, simply watching the fluctuation between the motion in water and the immobility of frost. Elsewhere, the constant shifting of the snow meant that any understanding of the mountain was temporary, a boon granted for a moment but easily withdrawn by a simple change of the wind. While she wrote, loose snow blown in the sun looks like the ripples running through corn. It could also blow past in a cloud, visible as it approaches, but formed of minute ice particles, so fine that the eye cannot distinguish them individually as they pass. And Shepherd captured these shifting patterns of the mountain best in her poetry. And I'll conclude this reading with a reading of her poem, Snow, where she talks understatedly about the complexity of the natural and human agents at work. I did not know. How could I understand? I, who had scorned the very name of love. Clear were my eyes, and heaven was clear above. Clarity held the long lines of the land. Hill after hill raced proud at my demand. too careless to be triumphant. Oh, enough of triumph had I, who knew the transience of clear cloud and wind, clear colour, earth blown and tanned. And now I am mazed to find my world sore altered in the passing of a night. And never a dream all night had round me curled, no sound, no proclamation, no delight of haunting prophecy came, no hurricane swirled. But at morn the earth was strange, a blur, white.
That section was one of the kind of revelatory moments for me in this book. My camera, by the way, has fainted at the sheer idea of it being even slightly chilly and has gone away. So I'm sorry that you can no longer see me, but I promise I'm still here and I can still see you. That last stanza of that poem is just so gorgeous. That repetition of now, no. It almost feels like a blizzard in itself, like closing you in somehow. It's gorgeous.
I love the emphasis on clarity and light as well, and that's something that's really struck me, even as walking's been limited, is the lusciousness of the light. So, this morning as the sunrise, the pinks hitting the snow on the hill opposite where I live, just this rosy glow emerging from it, and the blues seem to be such pure blues. And I think one of the things that Shepherd's poem does such a lovely job of is catching the way in which light interacts in all sorts of intriguing ways when there's snow in the air, when there's snow on the ground. And for her, clarity isn't just clarity of light either, it's clarity of perception. And I think the poem brings together those two ideas really interestingly.
Yeah, that moment where everything's blue and white and gold, and the way that it only gets at this this kind of season. That the passage that you that was in the middle of that, about the bodies found on the mountainside, I just remember reading that for the first time and just catching my breath with it. It's so sad. It's obviously, it's not the only moment in women's writing about the uplands where we hear about bodies being discovered a little too late on the mountains. So Dorothy Wordsworth, for instance, wrote her narrative about the Green family in order to raise money for exactly such a family, where the parents had got lost on a familiar route home, but they just got caught out by a blizzard, leaving their young children alone. Dorothy Wordsworth wrote this narrative to raise money for the kids. And this Laura Day in the chat has asked a really kind of interesting question about partly I think about the risks perhaps that all walkers take. But she says, it was interesting reading about how women such as Dorothy Wordsworth walked without all the kit that we need today, no detailed maps, etc. Do you think this has affected our approach to the landscape? And I just want to add to that, what effect do you think it would have had? Or do you think it would have had a different effect walking without all of that stuff then?
I think we've been, our acquaintance with the hills is based on a different premise to these early walkers who, especially when we're thinking about Dorothy Wordsworth and slightly earlier, the mountains are only just becoming somewhere that people even consider going, rather than fearsome, gruesome, gothic, frightening places. I think rightly now, and I've seen plenty of mountain rescue reports saying broadly this sort of thing, is you would be considered irresponsible if you weren't capable of reading a map, if you didn't have a map, if you weren't properly equipped for the conditions. But I think when walking, as it was in the 18th and 19th centuries, was so much more a part, just a fundamental part of everyday life. And people weren't necessarily venturing huge distances away from home. There's just a set of different expectations about what you would take with you. But I'm also thinking about how, as walking does start to develop, as mountaineering and mountain climbing become more popular. An incident that I wrote about with the governess Ellen Wheaton, who undertakes a solo climb of Snowdon. And what makes her account quite interesting is not that she's a woman walking alone, but that she is walking alone, because instead of a map, what you would tend to do is take a guide with you, would hire a person who knows the hill to take you up and down it safely. And this is a very common thing. Harriet Martineau, slightly later, in her guide to the Lake District, browbeats her readers into the importance of this. This is a fundamental aspect of safety. But Wheaton is very confident. She's read her guidebook. She knows what she's trying to accomplish. And even though an overly solicitous man coming down from the mountain with the guide tries to foist the guide upon her, she feigns deafness, ignores their entreaties, and writes about later how confident she was in what she was doing, and wanted to go up there on her own, wanted that solitary space. So I think there are various elements here that mountain safety was something that people thought about, but it took a different form to how it is now. You would actually take a person rather than a paper map or a GPS or whatever it is that you want to take up on the mountain now. But there was also much less infrastructure. So someone like Sarah Stoddart Hazlitt, trying to move from place to place by foot, just goes. There's no road to take her, there's no route, there's no map, but she goes. And I think that's a slightly different emphasis. I think we're used to a more curated landscape, one that's more full of infrastructure. There are very, very few places in Britain now where you can experience true wilderness, the Field Forest in northern Scotland being one of them. Otherwise, you're never that far away from visible signs of human habitation. And I think that changes the dynamic as well. So I think there's various factors at play there that sort of explain why we are so different in what we think is appropriate, and what earlier walkers and climbers thought was appropriate levels of preparation.
Yeah, I think the point about the guide is really important, that it's a sort of like taking a living map, and it's not a sign that you're an inferior walker. William Wordsworth, who climbed Helvellyn however many times throughout his lifetime, still took a guide with him most of the time when he did so. Dorothy Wordsworth on her climb of Scafell Pike was the same. She had a shepherd guide who bested her by understanding clouds much better than she did. She's going on about how well she knows the landscape, and the shepherd's saying, "No, I'm sorry, love, you don't." And she very charmingly kind of defers to the shepherds whose livelihood depends on knowing the landscape. She's very charming and funny about the fact that she was like, "I was an idiot, I'm sorry."
What I think I like most about those early accounts, this is perhaps an innovation that we could bring back, is that the tendency to not only take a guide but a servant to carry your picnic, and then sitting on the top of a mountain with a lavish spread because extra bodies to help carry it up. I could definitely stand to have that as a feature of my walking, someone to carry a massive picnic for me when I got to the top of something.
Yeah, everyone who's been walking with me knows that I need a regular cake break, else I get really grumpy. There's another kind of kit, though, I guess, that it might be worth dwelling on a little bit. So obviously a lot of the women that you write about in this book didn't have the same kind of weather appropriate kit that we use, but the clothes and the stuff that they did wear did impact on their walking. There's a really lovely moment with Ellen Wheaton, who I think is one of this book's like major revelations. May many more works be done on her, where she writes about her difficulties with the bonnet. And I just wondered what you'd found about how women's relationship with walking changes as gear changes.
Yeah, there's not many of them that I've sort of written about that talk explicitly about their clothing, which makes me think that certainly in the early period that there wasn't necessarily a special kit that you took up the mountains, that you went in what was broadly adapted everyday clothing. And this is something where I think you'll probably know more about it than me, having had to wear what Dorothy Wordsworth wore on the climb of Scafell Pike. But I think they were wearing broadly female clothing, skirts, bodices, bonnets. And I think the moment with Wheaton is a really lovely one, because I think we get the sense that is perhaps part of why women don't walk, even though we now know that they do. But surely the clothing was restrictive, and I think in some senses it was. But for Wheaton, she gets on top of this ridge on the very top of Snowdon and is suddenly terrified by what she can see on either side of the drop, and manages to get herself across by bringing the bonnet round by her eyes, so it becomes in effect blinkers as you would put on a horse that's likely to spook. So it's used to restrict her vision. So I think that's a really interesting bit of improvisation. But even Nan Shepherd, who was walking in the 1930s and 40s when gear really had changed, doesn't really talk specifically about what it was that she was wearing, or anything in particular like that. So that's perhaps a gap in these women's experiences. So maybe you could just tell me a little bit more about what Dorothy wore on that pioneering ascent in 1818 when she goes up Scafell Pike with her guide and her picnic bearers. What was it that she wore up there?
We don't really know. I mean, like you say, the details are really scant, and Dorothy's not really that interested in her clothing, is she? Like, because she's much more interested in what the state of William's shirts than in anything that she's wearing. We kind of guessed based on evidence that we could gather about what day-to-day wear would be like. We couldn't really find any evidence that there was specific gear for walking, and I think Dorothy wouldn't have worn it anyway. She's so kind of matter of fact that I can't really see her being the kind that would keep a special walking dress for good. It's impractical anyway, because she just decides to go off walking so impromptu. She did have, so she got a neighbour to put nails in boots for her and William as a kind of grip. Just disclaimer, we did not wear 19th century walking boots. Mountain Rescue would have had a fit. So we did wear our own walking boots, and we had waterproofs with us, which was good because we got caught in Storm Callum on the top of it. But I think when we did it, I really felt like once we'd done that, like everyone who wants to kind of understand what walking as a historical woman must have been like needs to go up a windy hill in a long skirt and a bonnet. The skirt, surprisingly comfortable, entirely impractical if you're also carrying a basket, as I was a picnic bearer on one of them. You can't, it's very difficult to do a scramble while you're holding a skirt up in one hand and a wicker basket in another. Pies everywhere. But the bonnet was the real kind of revelation from that walk, because exactly what you say, you can use it like blinkers. So I think I'm really kind of fascinated by the effect that this has on people like Dorothy Wordsworth's writing, because it becomes much clearer from a practical point of view why Dorothy's journals, for example, are so focused on details. Because if you're wearing a bonnet, that's all you can see. It focuses your attention in on an individual blade of grass, a flower pushing up through a rock, even like the individual bits of gravel on a path. The details suddenly become so much more heightened. It's like going around wearing almost like a portable Claude glass or a wearable Claude glass in the in the sense that you've constantly got that frame around your vision. It means when you're talking to somebody else as well, it makes it so much more intimate because you can't hear, because it covers your ears, so you have to be like quite closely looking at them.
I think that's a really observation, because one of the things about Dorothy Wordsworth's writing that I've really enjoyed and since writing the book have been looking at that 1818 ascent and the minuteness of her gaze. We're used to reading predominantly men's accounts where it's all about getting to the top and looking expansively, and that idea of conquering and bigness and vastness. And I think one of the things that Dorothy Wordsworth's writing really brings that's illuminating and enriching is, and I hadn't realised it was perhaps an enforced turn, but that turn to the very close, the very proximate, and the way that she talks about the boulders on Scafell Pike summit and the ancientness of them, and the beautiful life that lives in what looks to be, if you're just scanning, completely inert and dead. But if you're focusing, there's all these luminous colours, and she really brings that much smaller world vividly to life. And I think that Nan Shepherd isn't wearing a bonnet by the 1930s or 40s, but I wonder if that's something that runs through women's writing that we've perhaps not seen, is that different attentiveness, that it isn't about standing up there and looking at the domain that you've conquered, that there's something about that intimacy with the mountain that the shepherd does such a lovely job of bringing out. But that is in part noticing, showing respect to the place by, being so keenly aware of every detail of what's going on there. So that's brought a level of understanding to my knowledge of Dorothy Wordsworth that I didn't have, that you have to look like that if you're wearing a bonnet. That's absolutely extraordinary. Thank you so much for that insight.
There's a lovely line from one of Dorothy's poems where she writes, "A peopled world it is, in size a tiny room." I think it's just so lovely, that recognition that there's so much life even in the tiniest of places. One last question from me, and then I will switch over to some of the fab questions that we're getting in from everybody watching. You mentioned at the beginning that there were lists of women that you could write about if you were doing a slightly different book. If you were to do a sequel, both including women that you didn't write about in the first one and with a post-lockdown perspective, who would you include?
I am thinking about a sequel, so I have been giving this some thought. And one of the people that I'm hoping to write about in the sequel that I was really sad didn't make it into the first one, because again, the story I was telling just didn't quite work, is Mary Wollstonecraft, with whom you'll be familiar. I'm sure many people will be familiar with as a polemicist and a political writer. But one of the bits of her writing about her journey to Scandinavia in the 1790s, when almost no one did that, is the prominence of walking.
So cool. She's so cool.
She's so awesome. I mean, off to Scandinavia, this remote place that no one goes to, on a secret mission for your ex-lover, by whom you've got a child that you are now terrified to bring into the world because she's a woman, she's a girl. And Wollstonecraft spends this trip ruminating on what it is to mother a daughter in this world that's so hostile to women. And part of the way in which she ruminates is to take long strolls along the coastline of Scandinavia, this rugged, bleak, harsh coast, which seems to chime perfectly with this rather bleak and desperate mood that she's in, because she's an unmarried mother, she's unprotected, she's got a daughter to care for with no father, society's prejudices are operating against her, and there she is, walking. And I just think that's a wonderful story that I'd really like to do more with, and think about how that walking then becomes, in some senses, revolutionary. That Wollstonecraft is interested in the French Revolution that's occurring. She's interested in reforming society in a revolutionary way to make it more equitable for the two genders. And there is walking. She's pacing all of these ideas out as she's undertaking this mission for her lover, for her ex-lover. So there was just intrigue, scandal, and a mother-daughter relationship there that's incredibly tender, but also very sad. That I think it would be lovely to explore in terms of what walking brings to that, and how it helps or doesn't Wollstonecraft explore some of those really complex issues that she's being forced to engage with. So she's definitely in the mix. And then something that I've recently started looking at and need to do a lot more about is pedestrian competitions in the 19th century. And I was telling my husband about one of them that I'd read about, where the competition was to walk a mile every hour for 1,000 hours. And my husband was absolutely certain I'd made this up.
There's a guy who lives in Australia who did he ran a marathon over 24 hours, a similar idea. He did 1 kilometre an hour. So I feel like that kind of tradition is alive and well, but
1,000 hours, never getting, well, more than half an hour's sleep at a time, surely. Absolutely extraordinary. So I had to actually show him the newspaper article in which it was written before he would believe me. But there's a whole history there of women's pedestrianism as competition, as spectacle, with big prizes, celebrity, all sorts of interesting things going on there in terms of what more walking means, what women's physical accomplishments mean. So that's something I'm really looking forward to sort of burying myself into and finding out more about. So there are so many stories, and even if I was to write 100 follow-ups, I would hope and I expect there to be still more. So I hope that mine will be the first of many books that look now to recover these varied histories, that there's so much more to be done than even 1 or 2 books could possibly hope to achieve. And what I hope is now apparent, at least, is that there is a tradition there, a historical tradition that we are part of. All of us who walk now can draw on this legacy. And for me, that's been absolutely transformative in thinking about my own walking. Instead of looking to male role models, I can now look to women. I've got Dorothy Wordsworth in my backpack with me, reminding me to be attentive to detail. I've got Nan Shepherd telling me to think about my relationship with the mountain. What does it feel like to be here? Trying to find the inner places, both in the mountain and in myself. And these different ways of approaching walking, which I just didn't know were available. So having access to that history for me has been an absolute joy. And I hope that that's something that the book enables for other people too.
I can confirm it has definitely helped for me. I want to switch over to some questions that we're getting through the chat, and the first is actually to ask you to expand a bit on who had access to walking. This is from Joanne Coates, who says, one of the aspects of the book I loved was in the Dorothy Wordsworth section, featuring class and elements of who gets to walk. And I guess that's who gets to walk for pleasure as much as anything else. So could you talk a little bit about this?
And I think that's perhaps something I should have said, but when I said there's hundreds of stories, is that if you were a labouring class person in the 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th, before those centuries, you just walked. That's just what you did. That's how you got to market. It's how you took your goods home. It's how you got to schools. If you were going to schools, it's how you got to church. It's how you did everything. You just walked. So it's not so much that walking is only available to certain people. It's having time to think about what your walking means is the thing that's only available to some people. Walking for the pleasure of it and the fun of it, rather than the physical necessity of it. And that's absolutely tied up with class. So Ellen Wheaton's an important inclusion in my book, I think, because she's not wealthy. She's a governess. She's from perfectly ordinary labouring family, from a perfectly ordinary part of Lancashire. She's got no claim to any sort of social status at all, really. So she has to save up to be able to go on these walking trips. And Dorothy Wordsworth, again, not wealthy, but she does have enough social status that she doesn't need to work for a living. She looks after the domestic economy of her house, but she doesn't have to go out of the house to work, which gives her a bit more time than is usual to enjoy walking for its leisure. And there's a moment where she reflects on the difference in experience that she has compared to a woman who's crossing Loch Lomond with her husband and son, who has to walk to go and find work. So there's an awareness there as well. And I think that's really important, is to remember, especially when we get pushed with this narrative, well, women just didn't walk. Every woman walked who was of a certain class. They just did. So immediately that's not true. But the kinds of creative, intellectual, culturally significant walking, there are class dynamics bound up with that as well. And I think in some ways they're more powerful than sex-based social pressures, that it's actually having the wealth and time to walk that the greatest difference about whether someone does or doesn't, rather than are they male or female.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful point. Moving from historic women walker writers to future women walker writers, Rosie Miles says, as someone intending to walk 300 miles of the southwest coast path on her own, God, wow, and also writing in response, do you have any walkerly, writerly advice?
I'm just going to be outrageously jealous of what a wonderful
right
trip.
As I got halfway through that and was like, can you take me with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Walking the Southwest Coast Path is something I've done in bits every summer for the last 6 or 7 summers, except the last one. An absolutely wonderful place to walk. So my immediate and overwhelming response is utter envy at this wonderful trip. But I mean, I'm no expert at walking. I'm just an amateur. Like, most of my experiences are much more foolish than the average. I'm really quite deeply stupid when it comes to figuring out how to walk well. But I guess what I would perhaps hope would be that whilst we're walking in these routes, and you know, someone like Raina Wynne, who's written so beautifully and evocatively about walking the Southwest Coast Path, is that there is an increasing availability of women to take with us, and the sorts of things that Wynne notices in that continuous journey is really interesting, and being observant in the sorts of ways that Dorothy Wordsworth manages to be, and just thinking about that, and also perhaps having the confidence and the knowledge that we as women belong here. We have always been here. We've been walking for centuries, finding confidence and relief and ourselves on the path. So to never ever doubt that, and to sort of own the fact that this is our space too. But other than that, avoid doing what I did the last when I was on the Southwest Coast Path in 2013. Was just to trip over my own feet. There wasn't even a rock. I just tripped over my own feet and dived straight off the path into the brambles, where I ended up on my back, legs kicking like some sort of, you know, distressed beetle, so that my husband had to pull me up by the rucksack straps with a wrench knee and gorse and bramble wrenches all the way down my back. Don't do that. That hurts.
That's type 2 fun, that. I guess like one of the lovely lessons I feel like we can take from your book is exactly that, like feel like own the space, but take the time as well, enjoy the experience, and not just the destination. I think that's one of the, I think for me that was, I guess, the most powerful inheritance that I got from reading the book. I'm going to ask end with one last question. This one's from Thomas Moorcroft, who says, what are some of the barriers to walking equality that are still prominent to this day? As a white male, what can I do to try and make walking more inclusive?
That's an incredibly generous question. And I think asking the question itself is in its own way helpful. You know, just being aware is a really useful thing, because I think for men it's quite easy to just access the space and not even thinking about it. So I think being aware that it is different for other people is itself an act of allyship, which is really useful. Don't outrun your partners would also be my suggestion, as a woman who's walked with some not particularly.
Oh my God, as a woman who's 5'0", also I second.
Is perhaps be sympathetic that women's bodies work a bit differently. So, and in all seriousness, we've, as part of the Women in the Hills project, I remember we encountered some resistance to the idea that there were still barriers, because so many women were completely comfortable getting out and about, and resented the idea that they were somehow limited. But for other people, the perception of barriers, I think, was really powerful, that they were told by family members, "Oh, what are you doing out there? Be careful," which caused them to worry when they didn't necessarily feel themselves that they had cause to. So I think it's sort of a mixture of helping to create and foster an environment in which women are confident to do their thing in the way that they want to. So I've got a walking companion who is a little overbearing with the map reading, even though I'm perfectly good at route finding, though he has also pointed out several times when I've got my crampons on backwards. So as I say, I'm a real idiot when it comes to walking. So I think it's a balance between being aware. I don't think it's necessary for people to necessarily do anything in particular. Just be mindful that the experience of being outdoors comes loaded with different things. If you're a woman, that there are expectations that might make it harder for a woman to admit, I'm actually struggling to find the route here. Or, you know, making sure that women have enough space that they don't feel pressured to go faster or feel like there's, you know, someone lurking. It's just an awareness of what might be at work for other people. And as I say, I'm not sure that there are any physical barriers, so much as social constructs that have operated to restrict women's ability. You know, the fact that we do more care work. So if you are a partner of someone who and are having children, offer to do the care work so that they can get off into the hills. You know, stuff like that. It's just enabling that equal participation, I think. I don't want to get prescriptive at all, because that's not at all appropriate. But I really do think even asking the question is generous and extreme. That's really encouraging.
I think to add to that, asking the question is excellent step one. Talking about it to other men is a really important step to spread the word and spread the inclusivity and spread the generosity that I feel like, Kerri, you've really exemplified over the course of this lovely conversation. And your book really demonstrates like just the really impressive and open generosity with which you approach your research and communicate it and foreground other women's voices alongside highlighting your own. Even where, and I think just the grace of admitting mistakes, although I absolutely will not accept that you're an idiot walking. This has been absolutely lovely. Thank you so much for talking with me about this lovely book, which is out in paperback when? In
July. It will be available with a very beautiful redesigned cover, if that tickles your fancy.
Get your pre-orders in now. Thank you everybody for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening.
Thanks very much, Jo. Thanks to the NCLA too.
Thanks so much.